I remember when I was first starting out in information security that I remember these people used to come into the office and do audits and do posture assessments and do business impact analysis. And it used to really annoy me. I'm thinking, wow, these guys are adding to our workloads. They're adding much more stress. And fast forward almost 10 years, 10 years later, and I kind of now appreciate anytime we do security assessments because it provides a fundamental understanding to ensuring that we're basically appreciating to identify and ensuring security posture is relevant to the customer's needs. And in this video, we're going to cover the different types of security assessments. We'll cover third-party assessments, self-assessments, the different type of assessments and components across the life cycle piece as well. So the very first area that I want to sort of mention here is our self-assessment. And we can go away and we can perform self-security assessments ourselves internally. And this is typically done with people within the organization who will go away and will either audit or will do some documentation in terms of validating certain controls and measures within the organization. And an itching thought that I have with this is, well, what could possibly go wrong with having someone within an organization tell you how awesome the organization security controls may be? And if you're saying, well, there's potentially a little bit of bias there, well, you're absolutely right. And some areas to be, just be a little bit concerned about is there's a level of bias with not an E bias. There's a level, an element of biasness that can occur internally, and that can be influenced through several factors across the organization. And this can sort of sometimes falsify or prove incorrect, documentations or the validity of some security controls during the audit and procurement cycle as well. So typically, sometimes it can be typically with self-assessments. They can be performed with internal team members, so teams within certain divisions, or they can be performed with teams of external divisions. And typically, you may have a cross department that comes in and audits and validates certain areas because they provide that set of fresh eyes that they can come in and go, well, yeah, you're doing a great thing, or you're not, and how are we going to validate those controls? So typically, these types of controls are done periodically through environments. They help us prepare for, third-party risk assessments or third-party internal audit assessments that happen. And it's typically all to do with, compliance. So typically with organizations that require compliance, they have to get certified and have to get audited to prove that they've got, a level of controls, in terms of, documentation, processes, and the list goes on, right? So this is all in terms of compliance. And if we're following a specific framework in security, so if we follow an ISO framework, for example, we've got to have, either internal audits done internally. There's ways to obviously speed those processes up. If we know what those the document criteria looks like, we can go away, we can prepare certain things, go away, bring in a third-party audit team, audit, certify us, and then that's our process. So typically, these sort of processes are to help businesses provide that level of baseline security. And then from there, we can sort of dive into our third party. And third party is basically us bringing in a third party to carry out that assessment or part of that compliance process. So this is typically favorable across organizations who perform it themselves. Typically, organizations that tend to do business with other organizations will say, well, if we want to do business with you, you've got to show us your third-party audit certification or your third-party, penetration testing reports. So when there's companies want to do business together, it kind of goes hand in hand because each of them are going to sort of ask and request for third-party, documentation and processes that they are doing security assessments correctly, that they've got the level of baselines, the business is compliant with certain regulations and industry requirements. And of course, many businesses will only do businesses if certain businesses are compliant with obviously the different frameworks. So we've got CPS 234. If people in the insurance firm, if you're handling insurers and credits and stuff like that, they have to be compliant to that. The other one is the ISO 27001, which is a highly recognized standard and certification across, global certification. Typically, organizations will sort of have a standard or a framework. The NIST 853 is another sort of risk management framework that's quite widely used. It has information security controls. People tend to become compliant to those controls. So we can go away, we can build a kind of checklist across each of these sort of frameworks and foundations. And then, a third party team will come in, they will review our controls, make sure that we're doing the right things, and then they'll go away and then they'll certify us if everything is great and hunky-dory and, we've done everything that's correct. And typically it's every sort of year that companies will go away and they'll have to recertify themselves every year to be updated, and then to prove to the customers that they are doing the best to uphold the baseline information security standards. So typically, anytime we begin a self-assessment or anytime we do a third-party assessment, we just need to be mindful of a couple of things, right? So anytime what do we do typically before we engage? And a couple of things that kind of sort of come to mind is let me just finish writing this out. Well, the first part is we need to define the objectives, right? And then if we have a certain clear path of what we actually need to define, is our industry regulated by CPS 234? Do we need to have NIST 800 TAC 553, which is the risk management framework? Do we need to be compliant with the ISO 27001? Once we start defining what our objectives are, we can then tie that into obviously our risk management process, and everything is about risk management essentially. The business wants to manage and validate the risks. We have a checklist and a scope. We know what to look for, and we then need to know how we're going to build those key risk indicators and how we remediate any specific risk, both technologically or business risks that are associated with the business. Now, the other component of that is we need to have executive buy-in. And the reason why we need to have executive buy-in is because the executives have to pay for it, right? So we need to prove that it's not a cost center, it is business. We are going to be generating either new business because now we're attracting other businesses that want to do business with us because we have a certification. And we obviously need that authorization because typically everything has to go through the executive team as well. So we make sure that the culture is embedded with security. We've got buy-in from the executive team as well. And they're supporting us with our journey, because a lot of these frameworks, if you look at their controls and their measures, the need is to have the executive buy-in. How receptive are your executive team to security, and raising that awareness and ensuring that there's effective controls even at an executive board level to obviously technical and staff controls throughout the organization. So typically, what do we get out of these assessments? Well, what are the outcomes? And the outcomes are a couple of things. One is it measures our security posture, right? So our SEC posture. It tells us at a point of time where we are and where we're going to be going. So if I can just say, go down here and we do a maturity assessment and it says, you're doing all these controls really great, but you need to improve on your asset security because, how do we validate our assets? Maybe we don't have a certain control around that, but maybe within, firewalls and encryption and everything else around that, maybe the technical controls may be all great, but then as soon as it comes to our assets, that could potentially be an area that we're kind of missing. So if we go back to the outcomes, the measures are this. It's quite simple. It's telling us how our security posture looks at that point of time. So if there are certain controls that we need to work on, it gives us a point of time of where we are to where we need to go, whether it's up there or maybe we're declining, and hopefully we're not declining, but we're always on the steep and we're always improving. It prioritizes our security controls, right? And this obviously ties into our risk management framework as well. So once we have these controls, maybe down here that asset security maybe isn't a big part, but maybe we've got, a big another area that is more concerning than our asset security. Maybe we've got a couple of publicly exposed firewall ports that should be, removed or remediated because we've done a risk assessment against them. That due diligence and due care poses that, our exposed firewall has much more sensitivity than potentially our assets. Well, then we've got a priority set of list of controls that we then need to look at. So we can pretty much prioritize, what's the level of criticality based on our security appetite. And finally, if I can just maybe draw down here, is the other point number 3. So that's point number 2 and point number 1. And point number 3 is dollars and cents. At any time we spend money, people want to know what that return on investment looks like. So if we're going to spend, let's say, $100,000 on a security platform, or if we're going to go down the audit path and it's going to cost us, $100,000 every 6 months to do that, well, we need to vet that process. So the vetting process comes in to make sure that we are spending the money because, firstly and foremost, we need to be compliant with our industry regulations. So compliance is obviously that first part. But maybe the second piece is we get new business. And we can start functioning how that new business starts to look like once we go into the market, because now we have that accreditation. And then more businesses are going to be attracted to that because the other competitors don't have that. So as we put our business cases together with our executive team, we can start to define, how that starts to look. So that's kind of it in a nutshell when we start talking about our security assessments. Now, over here, I've got the different types of security assessments. And you might ask, well, aren't they all the same? Well, not really. There's a bunch of different security assessments that we can do internally and externally. And the first one is a very typical vulnerability assessment, where we'll go away and we'll define critical assets across the infrastructure, define their operating systems, define the versions, and gather a list of potential risks from a technical aspect in terms of our assets and hardware. The other one may be a risk management assessment, so a risk assessment. So you can have both an internal and an external party come in and basically identify business risks across the environment. They can determine the likelihood of impacts. They can determine the priorities of the risks based on the industry, and they'll come away and basically create a risk register if you don't have one. So that can be another sort of assessment that can also take place. The other one that we can do is a penetration test. And we've spoken about these, vulnerability assessments and penetration tests before. And typically with, certification processes and, once we do security assessments, things like that, they will typically ask for third-party penetration testing reports. So again, the third party is a little bit more favorable because you're getting a non-biased, specifically from a third party that's going to come in there and validate your security controls against your organization's security. The other ones are security assessments. So when we're talking about IT security assessments, so we can look at the NIST, as I mentioned before, 800 TAC 53. It's a widely used risk management framework that's been around for many years. Again, highly favored with both internal and external. It's across the risk management framework. It tells you how to handle information security management. And then we've got the final piece is our incident response assessment. So we can have people both come in and say, okay, well, we don't have an information security policy. We will need help to create that. And then we can go through a couple of areas. One, we can go through a walkthrough scenario where we can sit down with the engineering team and the incident responders and say, okay, well, walk me through the process if we get breached or if something occurs, and you come up with, a laundry list of scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3, scenario 4, scenario 5, and you go, well, based on these sort of scenarios, let's walk us through scenario 1. And we sort of build out a bit of a playbook and an understanding around the roles, the responsibilities, the outcomes, the triage process, incident investigation process. So you can start defining how that incident response process begins to play out again in the real world. You have your policy, you have your process, and then you've got your playbooks assigned to that. And then you've got obviously the technical controls that the technical controls that play into that incident response process. And then you can also do that through tabletops as well. And tabletops are kind of more discussion focused than actual walkthrough scenario. So in the walkthrough scenario, you have the team walk you through how they'll do that end to end. Where the tabletop, you're kind of defining, if we're going to exfiltrate data out of DNS, well, let's do step one. Well, we need to define what that looks like. Step two, you'll get initial access, and initial access will look like this because we're running Windows X. And to do that, you need to do XYZ, and we've got this control that mitigates that. And you kind of get to the point where you're just discussing that process across, you may have executive people through there, you might have the CEO come in, you may have the CFO as well, a couple of business unit leaders, and then you've got a couple of the engineers, incident lead or whatever. And then you kind of walk through that. Maybe you've got the PR team as well there to sort of, from a public relations standpoint, if you have to involve them as well from the media side. And you kind of have everyone in a room. You can do this across a half a day segment, a full day workshop, and then just do tabletop exercises with everyone and sort of discuss things, keep things current, and you sort of work through those sort of processes together. And you can do that through tabletop scenarios. And there's a couple of vendors out there that do things really well. I'm not going to talk about them right now, but just know that they exist. And then finally, as we wrap up this video, well, what does the life cycle look like? So what does doing an assessment look like from start to end? Well, the first part is we need to identify, right? What are our goals? What are the outcomes? What are the systems? What are the protections that we need to have? Typically, what is there? Like, what do we have? What are we going to do? Define the outcomes, identifying our infrastructure. And then as we move up the ladder, well, the next step of that is to protect. We need to protect the assets. And how do we protect the assets? Well, we need to define what those controls look like. Are they admin controls? Are they technical controls? Are they, a mixture of both periodically? So you define what those controls and those parameters are within your environment. The next part of that is detect. So we've got detection mechanisms in place, and then we start looking out for anomalies across, our assets or anything that raises security awareness issues or security incidents. And you're basically looking for pretty much the abnormal activity across the infrastructure. And then almost last is our respond. Our response. And our response basically says, well, now that we've found these security issues, how do we respond and how do we mitigate these? So this is all about response and mitigation. And what are the steps that we take to prevent the stuff that we've already identified that could be a potential risk? And then finally, our recovery. I'm just going to put RAC for recovery. And recovery is all about focused about DR and our business continuity. And then how do we go into crisis? So once we go into crisis, so you may have to have a contingency plan that defines our crisis management team and crisis communications, and how do we deal with that type of crisis? So crisis communications and our planning. And if something occurs, well, then how do we notify either internal people, external facing customers, and our core assets? How do we maintain the details that we've defined here across our infrastructure? So after we've defined all our parameters and we've got all our assets and we know how to sort of protect them, and we've built those into our playbooks and our designs and our policies and our configurations, the recovery phase is all about business continuity and availabilities, ensuring that the assets remain, available at all times. We can flip over if something occurs. Crisis team come into play. Everything is communicated if it needs to. So that's pretty much it for this video, as we've covered pretty much a lot of things for security assessment types. I hope that you found this video useful. If there's any other comments that you have, please let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.